All right. Good afternoon or good morning if you're in the East Coast.
Your sound is not connected, Frank. You might start all over again. Or we just pretend there's some music playing. How about that?
Oh, you couldn't hear the music?
Oh!
No.
You know what? I'll edit it in, so no worries.
Yeah, perfect.
That's bananas. Sorry about that. I thought the music was playing in the background, but actually, you use the editing too, and you actually get a lot better music, I noticed. So yeah, welcome to another episode of the Schuppi and ElPro MakerDAO Delegate special edition of the EndGame and the EndGame breakdown. So that's a mouthful, but it's pretty much a special edition where we're doing a special breakdown of the EndGame with a special host. And I have a co-host here today who's joined us before. You've seen him on the Schuppi and ElPro MakerDAO Delegate Happy Hour. Raphael, I understand you're on the east side of the world. Where exactly are you?
I'm currently in Boston, Massachusetts, visiting the Flipside offices and enjoying the great weather here. And actually,
nice.
Yesterday we were on a tall ship cruising the harbor, so that was nice. Yeah, really getting the best of the city here.
That's so awesome, man. I hope you went, did a little bit of rowing. You know that the Winklevoss twins did a lot of rowing there in that Harbor University Bay, whatever it's called. It's drawing a blank right now, but I'm sure Mark from the strategic finance would probably kill me for not knowing that. But anyway, so let's get into it. Schuppi, what's going on with you, brother? I know you are a big fan of the EndGame, so I know you've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, I mean, this session is a very special one, and we already had a couple of pretty special sessions already. But this is something I was looking for the whole last 2 weeks while I was vacationing in Denmark. This idea, I think Raphael came up with the idea, right? Of having this special guest here in this show. Wasn't it Raphael?
It was, yeah, I think it was either Raphael or you, one of you guys.
No, it wasn't. It was for sure. It wasn't me because I was vacationing. I was passed out somewhere else, but doesn't really matter.
I thought it was Frank. So
was it Frank? Maybe, I don't know. So it wasn't me, at least. So I was really excited for the last 2 weeks when I was in Denmark enjoying the beaches and the wind and the weather there, and the beer. I'm having a beer from Denmark here as well. For having this session today with one of the most prominent persons at Maker. LongForWisdom is going to join us here and giving us a special tour through the EndGame on his views. Some of you might have seen the post he was doing or the posts he was doing on the forum. Yeah, and today we're going to spend a lot of time with him, and basically it's going to be him on the stage guiding us all through the EndGame and his view on the EndGame. I'm really looking forward to do that.
Yeah, community blessing, actually, LongForWisdom. Sorry, I cut you off there. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you for coming on the Schuppi and ElPro MakerDAO Delegate Happy Hour. You got some delegates here, so I think 3 is definitely a full house. So hopefully you bear with us, especially Raphael. You know, he likes to cut in a lot, but I think it'll be fine. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so before we get to it, though, we do a special thing here, and it's pretty much beer tasting. And I'm actually back to beer tasting myself. I have a special beer here. I believe it's from a city called Mostov. It's a chocolate stout. I don't know if you can see it. Chocolate stout nitro. Yeah.
Why do you do that to you?
It actually, if you needed a pickup, it looks like coffee, right? So it's a beautiful. Look at that dark color there. Wow, it's pretty nice. What are you drinking, Raphael?
I'm drinking fine water, filtered by an original American filter machine, and it's also chilled. So it's a very special drink that's dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to drinking it.
Nothing like Boston's finest. Water, H2O. What about you, Tim?
Yeah, of course I have a beer. I brought some Carlsberg from Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. It's in a can, but I'm going to pour it into a glass because I can't do that in a can. That's yeah, you shouldn't do that, I think. So Long, what are you drinking today?
Yeah, well, like Raph, I'm also drinking water, room temperature tap water, in fact. Yeah, from the south of England. Yeah, couldn't rate it higher, really. Couldn't live without it. Pretty sure there aren't any lead pipes anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, we used to have those.
Prevent the squirts, you know, all good.
Yeah, New York City had a lot of those lead pipes, but thank God we got rid of them. But I mean, so we score these things from 1 to 5. So Long, if you want to give yours a nice sip and tell me what you would score it from 1 to 5, 5 being like the best water you ever had, then that's fine. But maybe you can describe how it tastes, if possible.
Yes, sure, I can absolutely do that. Let me take a sip. Yeah, it's water. It's rated a 3 out of 5, right? It's basically kind of middling water. I'm sure I've had worse. I'm sure I've had better. But yeah.
So you give it a 3.5, 4?
Yeah, 3 out of 5 maybe. It's
3 out of 5. Okay, it's doable.
Have you had actually better water somewhere in England already?
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
This is not like top shelf water, right? This is just like, you know.
It's just tap water, right?
Yeah, tap water. Yeah, I am.
The quality is good enough to drink it without.
Yeah, yeah. It's I'm sort of fortunate to live somewhere where tap water isn't poison. So you know, that's good.
Yeah, that's yeah, that definitely wouldn't be a laugh right there, right? There's a lot of people, unfortunately, that can't have good water. But Schuppi, how about you? You be the first one to try.
Yeah, I messed it up a bit, but I think it's already drinkable. It's at least cold. It's coming from the fridge. It's there for a couple of days.
Well, at least you're drinking a cold one this time.
Yeah, it's cold, but it's actually really flat. I'm disappointed. It was a lot better last week when I was in Denmark, but it's always the same issue. If you bring something from vacation, then it's just a mess at home. So this is a 2, sorry.
Ooh, man, tough critic today. Raphael, how about you? Boston's finest. It's got to be Boston's better than a 3.
So I have to, like, I'm probably more in the camp of Long. I think it's a 2 to 3 out of 5. It's pretty bland. You can taste that the filter isn't really fresh anymore. It's very chill. That's good. That's good. So there's a plus there. But let's say 2.5 out of 5.
Wow. And to think that Mark from Strategic Finance lives in Boston and drinks that water, huh? I wonder what that could be doing to his brain. Oh, just kidding. For those of you For those of you who don't know,
you have to edit that out. No.
I'm joking.
See, it's this sort of podcast, is it? Huh?
No,
Knives out, man. Knives out.
He's an awesome facilitator from Strategic Finance. Respect for Mark. Just poking fun of him. I'm sure he pokes a lot of fun at all of us, especially the delegates, right? But yeah, so mine's again is it's called Chocolate Stout Nitro. So you probably can't see it there. But yeah, so it's a stout nitro with a nice little cat there. So meow to the ETH merge today, and cheers to everyone who got it done, right?
Good merge,
yeah.
Good merge.
Yeah, it's
quite the accomplishment. Yeah, for sure. This is really nice, man. This tastes like chocolate. And I would say that I'm not the biggest fan of stouts, but I'm going to give this a 3.5. I think all of us none of us have a four-star drink on our hands. So, but anyhow, let's move on. I know we're wasting time here talking about water and not so good beer, but we want to talk about the post that was written by you, LongForWisdom. I just want to make sure you guys can see the screen and can see that forum post at forum.makerdao.com.
It's
you can
visible.
see it, right?
Yep.
All right. Perfect. So yeah, LongForWisdom, you wrote this, and first of all, I want to say that I think you're pretty much a gift to the MakerDAO community to have someone like you, to have joined MakerDAO. Back when you did, I think it was in 2019, if I recall correctly, maybe 2018. But yeah, you wrote this EndGame V3 summary, and it's version 3 because, of course, there's been a few versions before this. And right away, to get into it, you kick it off with the intro, the goals, the benefits. Pretty much you talk about how the goal of the end game is to overhaul and improve the Maker protocol, create a self-sustainable equilibrium called the end game state. And I really like that, by the way, me personally. Any other thoughts you want to add there?
Yeah, I'll maybe just sort of highlight that this is more or less a direct summary of Rune's endgame V3 post to the best of my ability, right? So it's maybe not strictly true to say these are like my words, right? Like I'm attempted to take what Rune had written and make it easier to consume, and kind of avoid injecting too much sort of opinion or bias or anything into the summary that would sort of impact how effective it was at what it's trying to do. So yeah, so I'll maybe just sort of preface by saying like it's a summary. I'm sure there are parts where I've like made mistakes and not faithfully followed Rune's post, but I do think, well, I hope I did a good job, and mostly it's kind of faithful to what Rune intended.
I think you did a fantastic job. I mean, the breakdown that you did here is, it's completely amazing. I'm not going to scroll through the whole thing, but I'm sure a lot of the community members know. For those of you who get to watch this or just join the MakerDAO community, please check it out. We'll post a link to it, to the EndGame V3, as well as to other versioning that LongForWisdom has put together. But you've done a fantastic job. So you get into the benefits as well. One of them being that not last or not least, but that there's actually, and use the word synergistic. Do you want to give us a breakdown of what you mean by MetaDAOs and the Maker Core and what the difference is between the two?
Sure, yeah. Again, so this is the word synergistic again comes from Rune, right? Like I'm trying to faithfully copy what he's put down. But I think the difference between Maker Core and MetaDAOs is that, so Maker Core is kind of what Maker is, a cut down version of what Maker is now, with sort of kind of core governance and sort of some very few internal teams. I believe possibly just protocol engineering, but maybe some sort of governance team as well, not 100% sure. And then MetaDAOs are sort of kind of a new thing that sort of Rune's come up with. That sort of combines, it's sort of like a combination of like a whole new DAO and a core unit essentially, or maybe multiple core units is maybe more accurate to say. So it's sort of an amalgamation of people from Maker starting up at a new DAO, which is aligned or more aligned to Maker than it is to, so it's sort of a separate like goal, right? So the idea is to create multiple of these MetaDAOs and have them all sort of go off in their own direction, but in such a way that sort of ultimately benefits Maker as well as the MetaDAO itself.
Got it. And you briefly, and again, this is your interpretation of what Rune is trying to portray the end game to be, and it talks about simplified tokenomics. Do you agree with that? Disagree with that?
So I think his comment on that was that it's more simple than the earlier versions of Endgame versus more simple than what we have now, because it's definitely more complicated than what we have now. But I think it is also simpler than some of his previous tokenomics structures under like V1 or V2 Endgame.
Got it.
Like how are MetaDAOs and Maker Core connected? Like how does that synergy really happen? I think that's like one of the major concepts in that plan is how these two entities interact. Can you give us a little bit of a breakdown on that?
Yeah, so we're maybe jumping a little ahead, but yeah, so I think the idea is that the tokenomics structure itself sort of encourages alignment, right? So MetaDAOs have tokens, like the Maker token exists. So there's this idea that we use yield farming of MakerDAO tokens on a lot of the core Maker products, so like DAI, eFalts, governance, participation. So the idea is sort of that as you participate in Maker Core, or even as a customer of Maker, you accrue these tokens and hopefully hold on to them, and yeah, sort of become more aligned to the MetaDAOs themselves. And in terms of the MetaDAOs benefiting Maker, they kind of provide a sort of redundant and kind of self-interested competitive workforce that is sort of more, is kind of more decentralized is one of the goals, and is also more, what's the word? Essentially more like, it's like safer for Maker Core, right? It's kind of the key idea, in that you don't have, or in theory, you won't have as many sort of diversion incentives amongst the workforce themselves, which is something that Rune has identified as a problem.
And that's what's meant by meta, or like where does this word come from, and how is that interpreted in this context?
Yes, so this kind of section is about meta, right? This is sort of the concept Rune's trying to get across. Like meta as a word kind of means above, beyond, etc. So the idea of meta in the kind of this context that Rune's using it is, it's kind of a description for all the sort of value that isn't like obviously financially measurable. It's maybe what I would say. Like it's kind of the value of like having a community that's sort of aligned to do something. It's like kind of the value that comes from, you know, people's belief more explicitly than sort of like fundamental and sort of tangible things. I think that's probably how I would describe it. And you kind of give some examples of this as well in like, I guess like sort of, I think you do like Uniswap, the community around Uniswap, specifically the communities around some of the like high unit bias kind of meme coins. So sort of like, you know, like the dog tokens, like Dog and Shiba Inu and all these. And how like, if you just look at the fundamentals, there's not really any real meaningful reason for them to have value, but they have value because of this sort of, they have like meta value because of this sort of narrative and sort of belief that they build up in the communities just by existing. So I think that's kind of what he's trying to get at when he talks about meta and sort of meta value. So hopefully that sort of kind of covers that. And then he goes on to meta engineering, which is more sort of like, how do you sort of like intentionally create that meta value? How do you sort of, you know, kind of harness it to bring like real tangible value? I think that's maybe the easiest way to explain it.
Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
Yeah, right. Sorry about that, Raphael. So in some of the tooling that obviously you're not deep diving into the meta engineering, but do you understand the meta engineering also correlates to the tooling for like building the front ends, where you're going to have the councils, you know, have the frameworks, and then eventually someone from a creator MetaDAO, maybe we're getting too far ahead here, builds a front end where individuals like myself or institutional players can yield farm, quote unquote. Is that part of the meta engineering you're describing here?
Maybe it's a little hard to sort of pin down exactly sort of what it is and isn't, right? Like I would say it's more sort of this concept of kind of harnessing like the meta value, right? And sort of both intentionally creating it and then like using it to bring real value, right? So it's like, because the potential danger with meta value is this sort of maybe I'm going a little off Rune's line here, but like the problem I kind of see with meta value is that it's sort of very like variable and dynamic. Like we sort of see this with the unit bias tokens, right, and some other things, right? They may, you know, spawn a lot of meta value and community alignment and sort of discussion and activities and all this sort of stuff. I think there was one example where some person who had like the Dogecoin like got a picture of like the Doge on like a Formula 1 car or something. You know, that just kind of happened, right? Like that's kind of an example of meta value, of like the community kind of making something happen because they believe in this thing. But the problem with that is it's quite variable and dynamic, which means it's difficult to rely on in the long term, I think. So I think what a lot of meta engineering is trying to do is sort of harness that and sort of make it something that is sustainable and sort of tangible value. So it becomes sort of less, less sort of unreliable, I guess I would say.
Got it. All right, let's move on because there's a lot here to cover. The introduction of the MetaDAOs. Here on this post, you kind of give your interpretation of what Rune is trying to portray that MetaDAOs should be defined as, which is pretty much the cornerstone of the EndGame plan. That's so well put there. I agree with that. And then you break into the analogy, which uses a lot of the layer twos, Starknet, Optimism, and Arbitrum, and maybe even CK Sync in the future. But anything you want to add here that maybe you forgot to cover?
So I think those are the analogies that kind of Rune provided. I think one that I might add on a personal note as well is it reminds me a little bit of like a kind of franchise model that some companies work under. So like I believe a lot of sort of fast food chains do this maybe, where you have like a sort of central company that sort of sort of manages and sort of sells franchises. And then the franchises themselves go out and make money and things, and they do it under that sort of brand, and they do it under. It's not a direct analogy because the idea is with MetaDAOs they'll have their own branding, but like it does remind me a little bit of that system in that like the franchisees, kind of agree to certain rules under which they can operate the franchise, and in return, like in theory, like the franchise owner and like the franchisee both benefit, I guess. And Rune gives a lot of other examples of like L1s and L2s, with Metacore being the L1 and MetaDAOs being L2s, and like Alphabet and like Google and daughter companies and things. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
I kind of, if you don't mind, a little pushback there, because in the final version that Rune posted, which is titled, I have it right in front of me, EndGame Plan V3 Complete Overview, and I'll link the post to it on the YouTube channel. But he talks about how one analogy is daughter companies in Alphabet with MakerCore as the Google subsidiary and MetaDAOs as Alpha Bets, I think he calls them, right? They're all bets, like betting in Las Vegas. And then he goes on to say how some people might think that this is just like a Maker as a VC and MetaDAOs as a startup, but both analogies are flawed. And they don't capture the true nature of the relationship between Maker and the MetaDAOs. He goes on to describe it as precursor cell divides, right? Sort of the human body and what it goes through, where the mother cell divides into, I think it's something like, and I could be wrong, 10 trillion cells over the lifetime of a human being. So do you think you are saying the same thing here, or he's kind of pushing away from the comparison of a VC and Alphabet, Google?
So what I think Rune is trying to do here is just sort of get across the concept of MetaDAOs and how they relate to MakerCore. And he's kind of provided all these analogies, which are sort of like almost what it is, but not quite. And I think his hope is that by providing like lots of them, like you can kind of abstract out the common factors and kind of understand better. So I'm not sure I really like, I mean, I don't think there's really anything here to like agree or disagree with, right? He's just kind of trying to explain the concept, which is that like, there is a MakerCore, which, it acts in some ways like a VC, in some ways like Alphabet, in some ways like a cell, in some ways like an L1, and it spawns lots of MetaDAOs, which are in some way similar to all these secondary things, right? So yeah, I'm not sure there's anything really here to agree or disagree with exactly. He's just sort of trying to explain what they are, and like he's kind of providing analogies to sort of try and aid understanding, I think.
Probably one of the most substantial innovations in the EndGame plan is this way of scaling a DAO. Would you agree with that? That kind of the way that MetaDAOs get spawned or clustered is I think is a pretty novel way to think about DAO scaling. Yeah,
I think that's valid. I suspect there are probably a couple of other people that have sort of, considered this route of sort of child DAOs as well. But yeah, like Rune, this is the first I've kind of seen that sort of goes into it in detail and theorizes how it could work. And yeah, I think as a sort of scaling mechanism, probably makes sense. I don't think there's like, so to put this, like I don't think there's like a fundamental difference, I guess, between scaling like this and scaling, for example, by having like lots of core units. It's more about like it's not like the MetaDAO itself that kind of is different from a unit. It's more just like the way the relationship works is kind of the unique, or not unique, but it's like different. So it's kind of like the relationship, which is the sort of scaling tech, I guess you would call it, versus like just like having separate units or separate groups or separate DAOs or separate whatevers. So that's maybe what I would say.
Cool. Well, and then let's get into the exciting portion, in my opinion, of the end game, which is introducing what, I think that when we say multi-collateral DAI, right, I like to think of more collaterals than just the basic ETH and wrap Bitcoin and even RWAs. But I also like to think that MakerDAO, and I once heard, I don't know, I can't confirm this, but MakerDAO could possibly have been a protocol that not only introduced DAI, the stablecoin, to the world, but also maybe other synthetics. And here with the end game, we're getting introduced to this concept of Ether DAI. You want to break that down for the audience, and what exactly is ETH DAI, as I like to call it?
Sure. So I guess maybe it's kind of hard to explain outside of just explaining it, but like, so make a mint DAI, right? It mints this dollar synthetic, like dollar pegged synthetic. Like Ether DAI is essentially a ETH like pegged synthetic. Like that's essentially the only difference. Like everything else will be the same. Well, the sort of structure is simpler in some ways, but in every way, like in every way DAI works, like Ether DAI would work in a similar way in its final form. It's essentially like an entire copy of like the Vault engine that when you put collateral in, you mint this ETH synthetic instead of minting this dollar synthetic DAI. So yeah, and Rune sort of there's more about this later on, but like because this is so important to the plan, there's sort of like a very sort of quick and dirty implementation as well, which we could sort of do very quickly. And then there's sort of long-term final implementation, which I sort of just described. And the very quick implementation would just be to essentially create a wrapper around staked ETH and potentially in the future other ETH synthetics, liquid staking ETH synthetics specifically, because the staking revenue is one of the kind of key parts to make this work, I think.
As someone who was trying to get the Eurodai thing rolling last year or 2 years ago, I can't even remember when that was. I just wonder, I saw the idea of having synthetics built into the Maker protocol is not new. That was something that was basically introduced very early, like basically 3 years ago or something like this, with the launch of multi-collateral DAI, that this would be the next step going into synthetics. So this actually is not surprising that we go there. But do you have any idea why we are starting to go with a synthetic that is actually volatile and not with another stable coin like pegging to a Swiss franc or Norwegian krone or the euro or whatever? Do you see any reasons why we don't go this path first?
Yeah, so I think the key reason is that it kind of aligns with the other goals of EndGame, which is sort of accumulating a lot of decentralized and like uncensorable collateral, namely ETH and ETH synthetics. And I think having sort of launching a synthetic version of ETH is very, in Ether DAI, is a very kind of good way of doing that, right? It also has potential like other benefits to the ecosystem, which I kind of like as well, which are like, we're definitely going to have competing liquid staked ETH synthetics, right? Currently, there's Lido, but Rocket Pool also exists. Like there's also like some exchange-backed ones. So, and that's kind of good, but it would be a lot nicer, I think, personally, if we had sort of like some generally agreed sort of fungible version of the liquid staked ETH synthetic.
So this is something like a very early way of hedging against the centralization risk of Lido, for example?
Maybe. I mean, it could go either way, right? Because the kind of danger is that Maker makes this synthetic, and then everyone uses this, and then that's centralization to Maker, right? Which is not quite so great. But it also gives you just the opportunity, right? Like Maker can decide what is backing, like Ether DAI. You know, so Maker can potentially, depending on governance will, can like actively focus on trying to make it as decentralized as possible, right? Like Maker can sort of reach out and include like our ETH, Rocket Pool ETH. You know, can sort of find other smaller like potentially liquid staking solutions, right? And also include those. So the sort of benefit of that is, I think that, I mean, again, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? It could lead to more centralization, but it could also lead to Maker sort of being able to defend decentralization, right? And the kind of advantage that the way it sort of does that is, if everyone integrates a Ether DAI into their dApps and all this sort of stuff, rather than staked ETH directly or Rocket Pool ETH directly, it means they become interchangeable, like under the hood, right? So if we want to encourage more diversity in liquid staking tokens, then we kind of can adjust the backing of Ether DAI to include more RETH, for example, and less like staked ETH from Lido. And all the dApps would just still work. Like that is the cool thing. Like, and if a new one comes up which is really promising, then we can just say, okay, yeah, we'll grab that for Ether DAI as well.
Yeah, I get that, but I'm not really buying into this idea so far, because I don't think that people are all going to integrate oil into their payment system, and this is how I see ETH. It's not a currency, and ETH DAI is also not a currency then, because it's just a synthetic on oil, if we stay with this analogy.
So I agree completely, but I would also say that ETH and staked ETH are going to be integrated into almost every dApp, right? Just for, for either like as collateral or as X or as Y, right? So I think it's more like that sort of integration that I'm talking about, I guess, rather than like real world or like currency integration, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, we deeply care about decentralization. So if Ether DAI is right now a move to avoid centralization on Lido, then it's totally also in our hands to make sure that we are not going to be the next one who is centralizing, right? So it's we have that in control. We can play with the parameters to avoid that.
Will you feel better if it's not called Ether DAI, but because DAI implies this kind of stablecoin thing?
Well, for me, it was always DAI was always something about stability. This is why I was thinking about Euro DAI and Norwegian Krone DAI and whatever DAI. But that's just wording. That's the same way I was not agreeing on the term meter when I was reading the first version of the EndGame. I was arguing a bit about the idea of having those sub DAOs called MetaDAOs, because I said, well, Maker is the MetaDAO and the rest is not Meta. They are just subsidiaries or child DAOs or whatever, but Maker is turning Meta. But I can totally adapt to
hey, time out. Did you say Meta? I think it's Meta.
Meta? What? Yeah, sorry. No. Meta. Yeah.
Meta.
Okay, but Long, it sounds like you actually agree to the idea of Ether DAI, right?
Yeah, no, I think Ether DAI is one of the better ideas in this.
I guess we are going to resurface this topic when we talk about protocol and vaults, I think, right? Most probably.
Yes, it will come up in that as well. I think it's kind of built into a lot of the endgame plan, like this concept of having Ether DAI.
What I found really interesting about what's it, Meta. So what I found really interesting about the introduction of those MetaDAOs or child DAOs or whatever was the idea of having dedicated new tokens for them and the whole overhaul of the tokenomics. So maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just because Frank was scrolling there, but would you mind giving a brief overview about the new token emission system that we are going to see and how this is going to work out? And also how you're feeling about this. This is something I would be really interested.
Yeah, so I'll first maybe highlight that technically this hasn't been agreed upon yet. So it's saying like in terms of like will or definitely or this is what we're doing things is perhaps premature. But I understand why everyone's doing that because Rune holds a great deal of voting power. But yeah, I can kind of talk about what Rune's kind of put in, right? So the general idea is, as you sort of say, every MetaDAO has its own token. And additionally, like users of Maker Core, so users who hold DAI, users who like want to be active in Maker Core governance, and users that hold Ether DAI vaults, which will maybe replace ETH vaults or staked ETH vaults. in Maker. So the idea is that all of these users will be able to farm the MetaDAO token of their choosing, right? Like by sort of working through that MetaDAO's front end, which is sort of going to be a sort of centralized sort of what's the word, like gateway, I guess, into sort of Maker's products. So yeah, so the actual, so I kind of don't want to focus too much on the numbers because they are kind of arbitrary. But like the sort of numbers of tokens for MetaDAO is quite large to take advantage of unit bias in the theory that will prompt meta value. Sort of that's one of the kind of meta engineering points. Yeah, so those are the sort of MetaDAO token emissions, and then Maker itself will also emit tokens to. We're getting a little bit far in here because we're talking about Elixir and Meta Elixir and things. So this thing called Elixir exists, which is an LP between ETH DAI and MKR. Ether DAI and MKR, which is essentially what Maker is going to hold on to, and MetaDAO is going to hold on to as a kind of treasury asset, I think is the idea, with the goal of increasing liquidity between Ether DAI and Maker. So the MetaDAO is also going to emit tokens to acquire Elixir, which is, I think, going to be created by Maker or maybe anyone. That's a little bit unclear, I think, in the plan. It's still like where it actually comes from.
Balance, I think, now was in the run.
Yeah, it's a balancer pool for sure, but I don't know. Like, I don't know if Maker's going to like retain the rights to create it, right? So I don't know if like only Maker is going to be able to create new Elixir tokens, or if it's going to be like most balancer pools, like any liquidity provider can put in like Ether DAI, Maker, and then get Elixir out.
Yeah, gotcha.
And I think we'll dive into that a bit later. Maybe I'll find a diagram on that while we're talking. But let's get into the next section, which is, it talks about something that, it's been around for a while, the DAI savings rate. I remember using this thing, man. I used to love watching just the DSR tick away. It was pretty cool. But unfortunately, that had to be shut off. It was almost like a test net, but it was cool to see. But here you talk about the active supply and the demand levers, which the best way I can describe it, and Raphael, maybe you want to chime in as well, is to kind of maintain the DAI stability peg, right, to $1 US. And of course, there's talk of possibly one day having to depeg from the US dollar and use some of this tooling, like the DAI savings rate or the stability fee base rate, that are known now as the SFBR, which is being introduced here in the EndGame, as tooling to kind of have sort of a target, and I hate to use that word, but maybe a target for a par price that DAI will try to peg to. Not necessarily $1 US, it could be anything arbitrary. Anything you want to add there, Raphael, before we let LongForWisdom kind of break it down?
I think I'm going to chime in when we come to the currency stances. I think my remarks make more sense there. So let's
okay,
for the time being.
Perfect. Any words of wisdom here, LFW?
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I think the DSR and the SFBR are kind of more or less things people will be familiar with from Maker. The SFBR is more just an abstraction of the stability fees. This is essentially saying stability fees will go up and we will control the DAI peg using those. The DSR, most people should be familiar with. You can lock DAI in a contract, you get a small interest rate, and that takes DAI out of circulation. So the kind of main new levers, there's kind of two new levers that Rune's kind of introducing here. I mean, I say new, but like it's not really correct to sort of label the target rates as new because it's actually very old. Going back to the sort of the original MakerDAO design and white paper. And it's this idea that you change the par, what's called the par price, which is sort of the internal value of DAI in the Maker system, and you use that as a tool to manage DAI demand and to manage the DAI price essentially. This is very similar to, this is essentially identical to what RAI does, though RAI has a more complicated mechanism for changing the par. Rune's kind of proposing to use a target rate, which is essentially just a thing saying the par will change by this amount over a year, right? So it's kind of analogous to like an interest rate or a negative interest rate on DAI, which would be more likely to be used as a negative interest rate in the current scenario. And this is both very strong and very dangerous, is maybe the best way of putting it.
What would a negative interest rate do for DAI's price? Like, how would it impact that?
Yeah, so what it would mean was that DAI's price relative to a dollar or to whatever it was pegged to would decrease. So, you know, with a hypothetical like target rate of like -1% per year, like after a year, DAI would not be worth $1; it'd be worth 99 cents. And like the maker system as a whole would know that it was its value was 99 cents versus just like external market trading, right? Does that explain well enough what it is?
Sure, but why would, like, what's the advantage of setting a negative rate? Like, why would maker choose to do that? I think that's probably something that...
Yes, so the key reason is that the negative target rates decreases the desire to hold DAI, right? Which is not good in many ways because we want people to hold DAI. That's kind of what runs the protocol. But it also causes a problem, well, a potential problem, in that we sort of see currently evidenced in the like PSM. So we see a large amount of USDC in the PSM backing DAI, and this is essentially because demand to use DAI as a stable currency exceeds the demand to create DAI using vaults. So what the target rate does is kind of like a very brute force method of saying, like, look, if you all want to hold DAI, you can hold DAI, but it's going to decrease in value because we need you to not hold as much. And the best way to do that is make it worth less. And it is very strong because many people are sort of very opposed to this sort of negative interest rate, right? Like no one wants to see the value of their supposedly stable currency decrease. And that's kind of the point, right? It makes people not have DAI or not want DAI anymore. And this is sort of where the very dangerous part comes in, is because once you let DAI's value change, and you teach everyone that like maybe it's not worth holding DAI because its value might decrease, it's very hard to unteach them that, right? It's very hard to convincingly say that no, it's going to be fine now. It's going to stay at the same price again. So that's sort of why it's very dangerous, because it's almost an irreversible, an effectively irreversible action that will decrease the demand of DAI. And since ultimately Maker makes money because there is demand for DAI, it does have the potential to be bad in the long run, right? And Rune sort of discusses all this here, and I've sort of summarized it as well, right? Cost is very high and very permanent.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
All right, let's move on to something that's actually being discussed right now. It was introduced recently, and I think my biggest fond memory of so far of this new protocol feature is going to be when Greg DePrisco of RWA asked on the Discord general channel, MakerDAO general channel, can somebody give me the Eli 5 of the POVE, P-O-V-E? And, you know, our fellow delegate, Paper Imperium from GFX Labs was like, what the hell is a POVE? You know, so I actually think it's a cool acronym, P-O-V for Vault, E for emissions, right? Emulation, sorry, emulation. So what the hell in the world, the Eli 5 LongForWisdom of protocol-owned Vault emulation?
Cool, so explaining like in 5 is Maker acquires ETH and uses it to mint DAI the same way anybody who creates an ETH vault would do. That's essentially the gist of it, very simply. Now, because this is Maker doing it, we can essentially allow a lot more than we wouldn't allow for regular vaults, right? Like regular vaults have a fixed liquidation ratio, you know, they have a stability fee, all these sort of things that we kind of need to be there to sort of balance the system and to ensure safety. And because Maker owns this vault and we can ensure that Maker's the only one that uses it, we don't need like explicit mechanisms like that to control its safety. And instead we can, you know, we can sort of do away with liquidation explicitly, and we can do away with stability fee. It's just Maker puts asset in vault and mints DAI against it. And the kind of benefit is that you can use this extra DAI to manage the DAI price, right? You can, you know, if you have enough ETH, it's just always the kind of that's always the kind of rub, right? Then you can, or enough collateral, then you can mint more DAI when the DAI price is high. Sell it into the market, hopefully lowers the DAI price a little bit. If the DAI price drops below the dollar, you can buy it back. And yeah, you're in a good place in theory.
So by that preventing the peg drift to the north, or what?
Sorry, say that again.
So by flooding the market with protocol owned DAI, and by that preventing the supply shortage.
Yes, though it's worth like something that maybe isn't apparent to people is that is the actual numbers behind this are actually kind of important, maybe more important than they are, for example, for the token emissions and things. You need a lot of ETH to mint significant amounts of DAI, especially that would or any collateral to mint enough DAI to mitigate something like the 3 billion DAI that are currently in the PSM. In order to mint 3 billion DAI from ETH that we own, we need to own $4 billion worth of ETH, and we don't have that ETH, right? And I think in the plan, Rune's kind of discussed how we can acquire ETH, and there are reasonably good ideas, but they're on the order of $1 million worth of ETH, right? So we can acquire $1 million worth of ETH. We can maybe mint 80 million DAI. You know, that helps. No argument.
It doesn't. No.
But it does help. It does help. It does reduce the backing from centralized sources, but it doesn't make enough of a change to actually remove them or balance them in such a way that they're gone, right? It doesn't fix the problem. It helps, but it doesn't fix it. That's what I would say. It does also have some interactions with the target rate as well, which maybe we don't need to get into because they're not huge and they're not sort of super important. But the combination of the target of a negative target rate and the protocol involved, it gets you a little bit extra stuff, basically. Just makes it a little bit more worthwhile for Maker.
But I mean, what I don't get, so we had the situation when we had this euro was dropping a lot, and the Swiss National Bank was just basically saying we are just buying as much euro as necessary, without any backing, right? It's a national bank; they can do whatever they want to. So, I mean, isn't it the same analogy that we just basically buy just enough ETH necessary to stabilize the price of DAI?
I mean, we can do that. I don't think Rune's explicitly advocating for that at this stage. I mean, it's definitely possible to just mint DAI out of nothing, buy as much ETH as you can, and put it in the vault. The risk of that is that almost immediately, if the ETH price decreases, then your DAI is unbacked. How much of a problem that is kind of open to interpretation. In the past, we've seen it as a big problem, right? But in the future, if we're setting a negative target rate, if DAI is potentially unpegging from $1 explicitly, maybe that's less of a problem. Kind of hard to sort of know. But the sort of general idea is if we just purchase ETH, if we mint unbacked DAI, purchase ETH without limit, we are potentially in a lot of trouble if the ETH price decreases.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't this going to be the case with the POV anyway? So if we, I don't know what the latest numbers are, but we are leveraging here, right? And if ETH drops by 80%, then we have unbacked DAI or under-collateralized DAI, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely we do. The difference is again why I bring up the numbers, right? It's a lot more likely that ETH is going to drop by 5% the day after we purchase a metric ton of it, than it is likely to drop 80%. So by only purchasing ETH when we actually have the assets in the treasury, we have the extra DAI, then that is safer than if we just mint DAI out of nothing to buy ETH, right? It's the same risk, but it's degrees. It's to a different degree. If that makes sense.
So the protocol-owned vault couldn't get liquidated on the ETH.
Yeah. So that is one. Well, I mean, it's kind of up to Maker, right? There's definitely wouldn't be an automatic liquidation. Maker could decide to liquidate it if it thought it was in its best interests. If ETH does start to drop by 50%, and we know that if it drops by another 10%, then it's going to be underwater, then maybe we do liquidate it manually. But it wouldn't be automatic is the main difference. I don't think it would. I mean, maybe we would want it to be, but yeah.
One last thought or question or opinion from you. Would you consider the protocol owned vault? Would you consider it part of the surplus buffer?
No, not really. Like, it kind of depends on what you mean as by the surplus buffer, right? Like, it's part of the treasury, but like the surplus buffer is separate from the treasury, even though it's kind of used synonymously often.
Treasury, sorry, I apologize. Treasury, yes, I meant the way that Maker right now holds MKR and a little bit of stake Aave and ENS. Would you consider it part of the treasury?
Yeah, I would consider the collateral in the protocol and vault as part of the treasury. The DAI minted from it would be like a liability, right, on the asset sheet.
Got it. Okay. And so I think that's something that the community tends to forget, that you know, Maker does have a treasury beyond the surplus buffer. And I think I've been guilty of that myself. All I keep thinking about is the surplus buffer is going down. Oh no, expenses. And we tend to forget that there is a treasury behind MakerDAO. But yeah, I want to move on to the endgame collateral categories here. Of course, the first one you pretty much write about here is decentralized collateral, such as ETH, NKR, right, which is part of the treasury right now. And obviously here you point out that ETH DAI is you know, one of the collaterals, not necessarily of the treasury, but it is a decentralized collateral, right? I mean, that's easy peasy. Anything else you want to add here?
No, yeah, that's kind of the first category is just ETH and ETH like derivatives essentially, of which Ether DAI is one.
Got it. And then you move into the MetaDAO tokens, which also, you know, can be labeled as decentralized. And then we get into one of my favorite subjects and some people's least favorite subjects, real world assets, collaterals. And this is something new the community hasn't heard. Cash-like RWAs. Can you give us the Eli 5 of what a cash-like RWA is?
Yeah, so it's essentially like PSMs and treasury bonds is probably the best way of describing it. Like it's RWA that's kind of pegged to $1 or is like close enough to $1 in the case of like treasuries. That isn't decentralized, but like DAI can still use it, right? Or under some stances can still use it. So the USDC and the PSM is the main example of this in its current as it currently stands in the protocol, and like the USDP and like the other sort of centralized stablecoins that we have backing DAI. Yeah, and then so Rune kind of it's obviously the upsides and downsides, right? Like the benefit of this mainly is that it gives DAI liquidity because we can offer at least for the on-chain stables, we can provide direct swaps through the PSM. So that means that if, for whatever reason, the demand for DAI rapidly changes, then it can be absorbed by that mechanism, which is really useful. And the downside is that it's potentially more easily seizable, or well, maybe not more easily seizable. It is as easily seizable as most of the other real assets, I think. Maybe more, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's like one of the main questions or issues I see with the endgame plan, that there is a lot of focus on making on like shielding Maker from jurisdictional anger in a way, or like adverse jurisdictional action. And I'm wondering like what your opinion is there on like how much of a price should Maker pay to kind of be completely safe on that? I mean, obviously that's like an existential risk, but like it feels that optimizing for one scenario might cost a pretty steep price.
Yeah, I mean, more or less. I mean, like any extreme position we take on the backing of DAI, right, saying like it must be all real assets or it must be all decentralized collateral or anything like that, it is going to come with pretty steep costs, right? Just because it's very hard to make it all of something without causing like lots of risk. Like one of the original like kind of aims of Maker was like the collateral, the whole point of the collateral basket and the collateral backing DAI was that it would be like as diversified as possible. And when you are diversifying, it becomes easier to mitigate kind of like systemic risks, I think, by spreading across jurisdictions, like spreading across, smart contracts, all this sort of stuff. So anytime you have a plan to do only one thing, you do kind of centralize risks and introduce other issues. Specifically with the, under like the haven't quite got that yet, but under the stances for like the Phoenix stance, which is the sort of maximal centralized collateral stance, no real asset collaterals. You essentially are in a situation where you need to activate the target rate, which we kind of talked about a little bit earlier. Like there's no other way to, well, so your choices are either activate the target rate or let the price of DAI float away from the peg, and just be fine with it not being close to 1, which is maybe acceptable to a degree, right? Maybe you can go like 5%, maybe 10% above before you start hitting like problems in the actual how the actual system works. But as soon as you start to get over like $1.50, then like everything starts to break down a little bit, in that like your liquidations stop working because the DAI that's supposed to bail out the collateral is now worth more than the collateral itself, and you just run into a whole heap of problems. So realistically, target rate's kind of the only option there, and that it is a big cost, as we kind of discussed earlier. Like it's a irreversible change to what DAI is.
Cool. And now we get into something I'm a proponent of myself, clean money or WA. We just heard in the last 24 hours that the founder of Patagonia is going to donate his entire estate, including his kids and wife. They all agreed to do this, right? To a charitable trust that's going to focus on initiatives that Patagonia supports, such as the outdoors, skiing, which I know, Raphael, you're a big fan of, hiking, which Schuppi, I know you do pretty much every morning out there in Germany. So this is an amazing thing, hearing from the Patagonia founder of what he's doing. And the Clean Money RWA initiative, focuses on things that you point out here, kind of like sustainable agricultural assets, and it's looking to achieve global adoption, and sort of make MakerDAO a brand that gets some attention that we're doing the right thing. Any thoughts you want to add there as far as clean money RWAs? Maybe you don't agree with them.
So for me specifically, or?
Yeah, for you specifically, yeah.
Sure, yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a positive initiative, right? Like, I think if we're gonna have reward assets, it would be good to have reward assets that like help the environment, right? Like, it's climate change isn't going away unless we do something about it. So helping something be done seems like a positive use of, I guess, a positive impact that Maker can have. And Rune sort of very cynically talks about some of the actual benefits to this, right? And that, it becomes a lot less politically feasible to shut something down if it's like helping solve the climate crisis, than if it's not, which is kind of a nice side benefit to having clean money reward assets. But I mean, the much larger benefit is just that maybe we won't all like die in like 20 or 30 or 50 years. So, that's kind of nice.
Yeah, for sure. Let's move on to miscellaneous RWAs. And these can be described things like wrap Bitcoin, which is still has a custodian known as BitGo. And, it could be anything else that's, I guess, a cross-chain bridge token from an L1, I guess, that's still centralized. A lot of these bridges, are still centralized and not permissionless. Anything you want to add there? I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory.
No, as you said, I think you covered it. The main kind of thing is that you need to recognize that the wrapped Bitcoin and similar things are actually reward assets versus decentralized assets, even though it's Bitcoin, which people assume is decentralized. If it's wrapped by a custodian, then it's not decentralized anymore. It's a reward asset, and we need to consider it as such when reasoning about the risks.
Yeah, and just to recap real quick, I think these are words that if the EndGame proposal does get approved by the MKR token owners, you're going to hear a lot of. Again, cash-like RWAs, clean money RWAs, and miscellaneous RWAs. So when you hear miscellaneous RWAs, just think of the the wrapped Bitcoins or some of the tokens that come from other L1s that are synthetics of the original token that was minted on something like Cosmos, Avalanche, or Solana, what have you. Also security tokens, which still haven't come into fruition. It's taken, seems, years for them to even get any traction. And then we get into physical resilient RWAs. And I guess the easiest explanation of this would be real estate, stuff that you can touch with your human hands. Anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it may be slightly misunderstanding what's meant by this category. It's not so much real estate. It is sort of physically stuff you can physically touch, but the idea is that it's stuff in the physical world that can't be touched by governance or jurisdictions. And Rue kind of rightly points out this is pretty theoretical. And the example he kind of gave was like, you could perhaps potentially have like a renewable powered drone ship that sort of floats around in international waters and I guess does things, or maybe delivers cargo or something. Yeah, I'm not sure. But it seems a little naive to me, right? Because I mean, maybe you can own like satellites, and that can be realistically considered physically resilient. But I mean, the issue is like, if the US government or any government decides they really don't like us, like they're going to sail up to the thing and shoot it with a torpedo because they have torpedoes, and Maker doesn't. So I think it's I don't really think it's worth considering as like a viable category, to be honest. Something very significant would have to change in the world, I think, before this was a thing.
Well, I think to be fair, in the United States, you can't get kicked out of your home if you don't pay your mortgage or your rent. So that could be resilient. I mean, you can be a home squatter. That's what we call them here in the US, for a good 12 months before the judge kicks you out. But yeah, that's not probably the best strategy to be physically resilient. But yeah, I like the idea of having satellites up there. And like, I guess the argument there is that if one of the government bodies of the world shoots down that satellite, it can pollute the whole world, right? Or something like that. But yeah, this is interesting. I'm not sure if we're going to hear a lot about it, physically resilient RWAs, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But let's move on to the world currency stances. And the first word you write here is what? Can you get into why?
I think I got into why later on. But yeah, I mean, the gist of it is this is essentially like a way of thinking of how like Maker works with respect to collateral, I guess, is the easiest sort of distinction. Like it's a way of sort of kind of very quickly summarizing, communicating about like, I guess what people want from, or what individuals want from Maker's collateral like backing. So just, I mean, to give a brief overview, they are like, there's three stances. I think it's Pigeon Stance, Eagle Stance, and Phoenix Stance. Where Pigeon Stance is more or less where we are now, where we sort of have lots of real assets, don't worry too much about it, or well, some people do, but up to this point, up to the Tornado stuff, we didn't worry too much about it. Eagle Stance is sort of somewhere that's sort of more leaning in the direction of decentralized assets, but I think it's a cap of like 25% of the backing. Sorry, leaning more towards decentralized assets with maybe 25% of the backing, like a cap of 25% of the backing for real world assets. And Phoenix Stance, which is like entirely decentralized assets. So I think they're mainly useful just for like they're like kind of a communication tool more than anything. Like kind of is maybe their most useful things. Like it's very easy for someone to communicate and say like, I think Maker should be in Phoenix Stance always, right? And that like the word Phoenix Stance then like explains like all of this thing because it's a shared concept. So I think that's kind of the main benefit. Within the plan, Rune kind of goes further and sort of says that there should be sort of specific predetermined rules about like how Maker moves between these stances. With the general sort of gist of being like that Pigeon Stance is more profitable for Maker in the general sense. Like Eagle Stance is kind of a mix, and then Phoenix Stance is kind of the most resilient. Is also likely to be less profitable. So you essentially have this scale of like profitability versus resiliency, I guess, or like yeah, I think that's the gist of it. Yeah.
So the first stance is the pigeon stance, which would be the initial stance that Maker will take if the endgame is adopted by NPR token owners. And there's some targeting rules there that you talk about here in the lower portion of this explanation of the pigeon stance. You want to kind of give us a quick breakdown?
It's probably not worth it, to be honest. They're the sort of thing where they potentially can change, and like it's not that important what they are, like in specifics. Like the gist of it is like the tools we discussed earlier to control how stable DAI is, like the target rate, the DSR, the stability fees, the critical and vault. Basically, we'll do different things with each of those tools, depending on which stance we're in. And if certain conditions change, then it will trigger changes between stances. It's not super important right now to know the details of those, I don't think. The gist of it is like Maker will move towards Phoenix to move from Pigeon stance to Eagle stance to Phoenix stance if it looks more likely that the sort of hostile regulatory or conditions kind of continue or expand or extend, right?
The interesting thing about that as communication is that the picture of these three birds has been picked up by Bloomberg and like I think a couple of blogs. So when you mentioned that it's effective for communication, I think you really hit the nail on the head, because that's what we've already seen happening.
Yeah.
And just to make sure that folks that watch this understand and who haven't reviewed the endgame as much as you have, LFW, there's a rule here that says if RWAs are greater than 25%, then 90% of the protocol surplus must go to accumulate ETH DAI. Can you explain to the audience how does that happen? How does the surplus buffer go out there? I know there's a module called the DSS kiln that can be used, but if you kind of give us an idea, your interpretation of how that will be done, if possible, right? Because it's possible that this hasn't been designed. So
yes, so I think the initial idea is that it would just be done manually and replaced with automatics, as soon as possible, where possible. Exactly what they'll look like, I don't know. Like it's not sort of like revolutionary stuff though. That like there exist contracts to like, buy assets, like swap assets, sell assets, do X and Y and Z. So I don't think we'll see anything like revolutionary in like how it's done. It will just be like an implementation that's goes to an exchange, buys a thing for another thing, deposits it in a contract the maker owns or in the vault, and then mints DAI with it. It'll be, something like that, and that's sort of well understood enough. I think that it's not super relevant which like solution we use. It's just something that does that.
Got it. And the idea is that the pigeon stance can, last up to 36 months. And possibly if there are no, what's the best way to describe it, I guess, any governing, regulating bodies threatening the Maker protocol, or they become friendlier to the MakerDAO protocol and its mission and vision of having an unbiased stablecoin like DAI, can we continue to stay in the pigeon stance? Is that the right analogy here, or do we move to the eagle automatically after 2.5 years, as you wrote here?
So I mean, as written in Rune's thing, as I said, he would want to move to eagle after 2.5 years. But I think it does specifically say the DAO can extend it if everything looks fine. Like it's sort of, so I mean, this is still kind of up to debate because some people are very decentralized maximalists, right? But the longer the protocol is in pigeon stance, the more it benefits in terms of like money, right? Like, and having that money will then help if and when we do need to move to Phoenix stance, or it might just be even in 20 years, like we've accumulated such such an amount of funds that we can just move to Phoenix stance and have it not affect anything. Like if we could move to Phoenix stance without activating the target rate, great, that would be amazing. We'd be fully resilient and DAI would still be pegged, and we'd be fine. In practice, I think it's more just like, I think in everyone's kind of hearts, we would like to be Phoenix stance or at least eagle stance in the long run, at least. Some people obviously want it a lot sooner. But I think the reality is that just like if we do it, like if we did like tomorrow, it would be a disaster because you know, well, it means that again, some people would like cheer it as the sort of savior of this, you know, the saving move, the move that saved Dai and all this sort of stuff. But it would very much change what Dai was, and what's the word? Kind of alienate a lot of our existing Dai holders and users, which I think we would want to avoid. So it's very much like Pigeon Stance is good because it gets us lots of money, and we can later use that money if we are forced to move to Phoenix Stance.
But isn't this all? Well, I read this a bit like we are basically having a plan with a big if, just to be prepared, just to have this this Mario Draghi thing, whatever it takes. So we are laying out a plan if the regulatory landscape is turning hostile, that we have a way of dealing with that, and we not necessarily need to go there in like whatever time frame is necessary.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, having the plan is good, right? Like having a well-defined way to mitigate that risk if we need to quickly is huge benefit, right? No arguments here. Yeah, the question is more just like, well, I mean, there's no question, right? Like, it's good to have it, like, and to have this communication tool. It's one of the more
just as an example, I totally would like to avoid having a negative interest rate. I think that would be in the current situation would be a disaster, and I agree that talking about this is already some kind of communication disaster. But if you see it as we have this as a tool, basically like a nuclear weapon that we could use, but we would rather not like to use it, and we would like to avoid using it, then it's actually fine. I mean, this is how the Cold War worked, right? I mean, the nuclear weapons are just only bad if they are used. If they're just there, then it's just a mitigation plan. So, and I actually wonder if we can flood the market with a POV. Is that the right one? Protocol-owned vault emulation. If we can flood the market and buy up ETH, maybe that's good enough to prevent the depegging and the necessity for a negative target rate or for a negative interest rate.
Yeah, it's possible. It would be like a huge gamble, right? Like that's the issue. Like if we just bought like a ton of ETH and ETH value goes up, then yeah, we won, right? Like we're in a great shape. But there's obviously always the possibility that it won't do that. I think your kind of comment on the deterrence thing is interesting. I kind of agree. It could behave like that, and I think if like you know, sort of all, you know, politicians and governments were perfectly rational, like it would work well, you know, in that like Maker can provide a lot of value in that it can support these green projects, it can support, you know, just sort of general like development projects and like spur economic growth within, you know, these, you know, within these jurisdictions, and it can't do that if it's regulated against heavily, right? But like a deterrent only really works if everyone's rational, or if like the consequences are so dire that it's like impossible to ignore them. Whereas like the consequences for getting rid of Maker or for a jurisdiction getting rid of Maker aren't really that dire. Like there's lots of other things that can spur economic growth and renewables. Yeah, so if it is a deterrent, I don't think it's a particularly strong one, but it's got the potential to be there, I guess.
Let's switch some gears here, and I want to get into another post that you put up about 24 hours ago, I believe, called the EndGame commentary by LFW. And one of the things, we'll get back into the EndGame summary, but one of the things that you said was the importance of a buy-in. Can you get into a little bit into that? Why it's important for not only MKR token owners to buy in, but also the community?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can kind of summarize it. I mean, essentially, it's just that what EndGame represents is like a complete change in direction and like structure of what MakerDAO is, right? And changes that are that complex and that kind of, you know, wide-reaching and kind of deeply affecting everything tend to be difficult to do, right? Like there's just a lot to do. Like it's complicated. It needs to work together. We need to you know, make course changes where things don't work, all these things, right? And the kind of you know, assumption based on that is that the best chance you have of this thing working is if it's like this really big complicated thing that affects everyone is going to work, is if you have everyone agreed that it's a good thing to do. Because it's kind of just human nature, right? Like if someone doesn't believe in something and believes something's being like imposed upon them that they don't want, like they're not going to work as hard to do it. Like it's not like because they're evil or malicious, it's just natural. Like, you know, some people might leave, they might decide they want to, you know, spend their time doing something else. Some people may not be able to leave or may not want to, you know, either because of their circumstances or just because they're less, I guess, ideologically driven. You know, so they'll stay. Maybe they're not sort of heavily invested in the changes, but they'll stay. And that's kind of okay. But it's the sort of thing where, it's the sort of plan where it's so big and complicated that you need people to be actively looking and searching for and fixing problems, and like adjusting things and, you know, making it work. And people who are just like there for a paycheck aren't going to do that. Like they're gonna do what they're told. You tell them to implement X, they're going to implement X, but they're not going to look for reasons why X won't work. They're not going to suggest improvements. They're not going to do, you know, X plus Y or X plus Z. Like they're just going to do X, and then if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter to them. They get the paycheck, they go home, right? Or stay home or go to sleep or whatever. You know, so this is kind of what I mean by the importance of buy-in, is that if we don't have that for EndGame, then I don't think, well, I think there's a risk that it won't go very well, because you will lack that sort of initiative and drive to fix problems, because you have a large portion of the workforce who just won't want it to happen. Or even in the worst case, like if people leave, then you have like half a workforce. So you're sort of on top of struggling on changing everything, and you're also struggling to hire people to do something that like you haven't even fully defined yet. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, just that you need people to, like, for something like this, you need people to believe in it for it to work, I think. And I'm worried that we don't have that with EndGame yet. Like, I think there was a poll on the forum that was like, I think it was kind of insane how like equal it was. It was something like a third of people supported it, a third of people were against it, and a third of people abstained. Which is like the most kind of equal, like, kind of maybe that you can possibly get as a signal. And I think that's a risk, essentially.
Is there anything that you're directly missing in terms of generating buy-in? Because I totally agree, buy-in is absolutely necessary, but we shouldn't target for 100% because we will never get there. We will, yeah. with every change, you're going to lose buy-in from people, and at some point of time, people will just leave. That's just natural. That's in every organization that is changing, every product that is changing, you always leave people. That's just the nature of it. But is there something that you're actually missing in terms of actions or tools that we can use to create more buy-in there? Because I actually really enjoyed, and I was really passive of that. I really enjoyed, I don't know, when was it, like 5 months ago, having a first read in the first version of, was it even called EndGame by that, or was it even, I don't know, it was post Sagittarius engine, I would say.
MakerDAO, I think it was.
But I really enjoyed being able to lurk into this and feel part of that, even if I was not heavily contributing to that.
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is I don't know, right? Like, I'm not really an expert in people. I will kind of observe that people tend to be the most bought into things that they have like agency over and like a say over, right? Like, if someone feels like something is like their idea and they are part of it, they are much more likely to go like to be, you know, to view it positively and work to make it a success. I think that is what's lacking to a great extent, but I also don't think there's an easy fix for that, right? Because it's almost by definition like Rune's idea more than anyone else's. Like, if Rune wasn't here, it was this, like, EndGame wouldn't be here. And I don't know that you can chain, like, I mean, you'd have to do something really extreme. Like, you'd have to essentially have Rune just like say, right, hands off, not doing it. Like, you guys, this is the plan. This is what I've given you. Make it work. And if Rune did that, like, maybe people would like rally around it. Maybe people would make it work. And because they were making it work, they would feel a part of it and like that it was theirs. but I don't really know if there's anything that we can do now that will change the perception that is runes rather than the communities. And
I don't know.
that's,
We had Derek with us. I don't know, 3 weeks ago or something like this. And I was asking him how much the stuff going on in the forum is a distraction, and how much he actually feels involved, or how his team is involved, and how buy-in is generated. And he was explicitly saying that he and his team are having meetings with Rune, talking about stuff like this, which from my point of view is exactly the right thing that needs to happen. Because if you don't get the protocol engineering guys on this plan and being part of that, not only being convinced that it's a good idea, but also being able to actually contribute, or at least put in their ideas onto it by improving it. I had the feeling that at least for protocol engineering, Rune is already doing that, advocating in terms of not only trying to convince, but really engage with people. And I mean, the whole DVC thing is something that I see as a tool for people to actually not only get a Rune radio show, but actually being able to participate, which is probably hard with Rune, but I don't know, maybe I just have a small sample size, but at least from protocol engineering, I can say what I see, what I heard from Derek is that Rune is actually doing that, trying to generate buy-in.
yes. So to be clear, like I've heard that too in other teams that aren't PE, right? And I think you're correct. I think Rune is trying to do that. I don't think Rune is particularly good at doing it, is what I will say. Just as a sort of general rule, like he's very good at coming up with ideas and building these structures. I think he is less good at convincing people that they are good structures. He's not terrible at it. Like, often he's all right at it, but yeah. So I think that I kind of agree with you. I think Rune is trying to create buy-in and is actually trying to make this work. I do kind of think that Rune's version of creating buy-in is more like kind of going to people, talking to them, and trying to convince them, versus going to people and like talk to them and asking them like, how can I make this work for you, right? If that makes sense. Like, maybe that's not fair. Like, I think he does do that to some extent, but I think, I don't know. It feels very much like his vision that he's trying to fit you into, versus a shared vision that you sort of naturally slot into, right? If that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't. It's,
Yeah, no, it does. And I want to actually zoom into something else you spoke about here, because speaking of Rune, I think, one thing, in my opinion, he's trying to do here is kind of solve the politics of MakerDAO. And you speak about this on the EndGame commentary post here. You talk about how the attempt here, and I truly believe this because I think it's been a mess, right? As someone who spends literally 7 days a week and as many hours as possible on the Maker Forum and the Discord, there's just a ton of politics and drama and what have you. And I'm guilty as charged. I participate in some of that stuff, and maybe I need to write things down first and think about it for 2 hours before I hit the send button, right, Raphael? You could read, you could kind of. You can kind of,
Frank,
as a reference.
I think you're doing good. I mean, I think it's just something in the nature of online communication that tends to kind of divide people.
Get lost in translation. Yeah. But let's get into the politics here. You talk about the politics. What are you what signal are you sending here, if any?
Mainly that, like, I essentially don't disagree with any of you, right? Like, it's not been great the last little while, and I think it is a consequence of online communication for sure. I don't think it's only a consequence of that, but I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, the gist of what I'm saying is I just don't think this is going to go away by introducing MetaDAOs, right? Like, there's kind of some examples of this, in sort of the wider crypto community, right? Like, there are DAOs that have worked together before, or tried to work together before. They've had proposals. Explicitly, like, people from one DAO have come to another DAO and said, like, we have this proposal. Or some people from both DAOs have come to both DAOs and said, we have this proposal. I don't know how it's going to change, and sometimes that's seen as good, sometimes it's seen as bad. Like, in some cases, like, spectacularly backfired, and it's been a huge part of drama. but I don't think you can really get away from the fact that at some point someone has to sit down and do the proposal. Like you can't really like have like the DAO itself can't do things like a DAO isn't a person. Like it doesn't have it has agency only so much as people give it agency. So I think the sort of what's the word? Yeah, like the argument that like that moving to MetaDAOs and going to a DAO to DAO structure will sort of eliminate politics, or I mean, maybe I'm misrepresenting the argument, like reduce politics. I think it's possible that it will help, but on the long run, I don't think it will, especially in the medium term. And I worry that like the medium term will just sort of naturally extend into the long term, in that like the MetaDAO, the initial MetaDAOs are going to be sort of made up of core unit people and people currently in Maker. So like all the existing politics is going to sort of come with them, right? Like it's not going to disappear when they create a MetaDAO. And I kind of just worry that's human nature, right? Like humans will politic, and it's especially apparent if like people feel that they're in danger, I guess, right? Like that tends to be the time people, especially people that don't normally, engage in politics, start engaging in politics, is when they're like worried for their like safety or their security or stability or whatever. And like the EndGame plan kind of blows everyone's security, safety, and stability right out of the water, in that it's changing how the entire workforce works. So yeah, I don't think it's going to help. It's essentially the argument, and I think there's definitely a risk that it won't work. And if it doesn't work, then like, what does politicking between MetaDAOs look like? And is that worse or is it better? Because there's definitely potential for it to be worse, I think, because you have like all these separate groups who are now like they're now like boundaries, like more like sort of separators. Like you have people from like this MetaDAO but not from this MetaDAO. So you have people engaging and like they're trying to paint each other's arguments as like, oh well, you're only saying this because it benefits your MetaDAO and like all this sort of stuff. So and like we currently, I mean, to some extent we have this with core units, right? You have people arguing things and other people saying like, oh, you're only saying this because it benefits your core unit. Fine, but in EndGame we're going to have MetaDAOs, we're going to have core units, we're going to have councils, tribunals, like there's all these other groups or new like groups that are all also going to have like goals, also going to have incentives, and I suspect also have politics, and there's going to be more of them, and like yeah, that's the gist of it.
I think like what the EndGame tries to solve is the question of size, so where smaller sizes probably tend to form tighter barriers and then like group people according to their inclinations and interests. And maybe you can go into how that works with clustering, like how MetaDAOs in the EndGame are formed in a truly decentralized fashion by clustering around interests. I think that's one of the more fascinating aspects of the EndGame plan that I have seen.
Yeah, we can talk about that. Yeah, I mean, for this, I agree with you. I think that is, to the extent that it will reduce politics, I think that will be the reason, in that it allows people to self-select the groups that they work with more explicitly than it does currently. Because currently you do have the situation where there's people in the same core units that have different sort of political stances, for lack of a different word, right, which can cause contention. So if you allow people to sort of cluster as they want into their own groups, then maybe you reduce that. But on the other hand, like nobody agrees with everyone with like, you think of your friend group, like you don't all agree on everything, right? Like you might agree on like 80% of things, but it's not going to make the problem go away, I don't think. But I do think, but that is one of the benefits, I think, of like a MetaDAO-like structure, or a structure where like individuals can self-select groups to work with. I think that's a benefit.
Yeah, I think that you point out that it could actually increase factionalization, where people align around common interests and then see the other interests as opposing their interests.
Yeah,
that's a real risk there. I think that's a really interesting way to view that.
Yeah, there's the old experiment that's quoted, which I think has actually been discredited, which is the whole groups of children in the woods, and you separate them into two groups and they start fighting just because they're in two groups, and start taking on like identity and start hating each other. But as I said, I think that was discredited at this point. But there's definitely some element of it that can happen for sure.
Long, you touched upon something there which we haven't spoken about. I mean, there's so many things we haven't spoken about, but it was the tribunals and the council. So maybe we could kind of, you speak about it here, the MetaDAO clustering, which Raphael was asking, and the workforce, administration teams, contribution teams, ecosystem actors, which is, from what I understand, below the council. So yeah, if you could kind of give us a as best as possible breakdown of this.
Yeah, I can try and explain it. I do feel like this is one of the more complicated parts, and I'm not entirely confident I've understood it fully. So, you know, take this with a grain of salt, I guess. So maybe we'll start at the MetaDAO level. So at the MetaDAO level, there is at least one administration team, which is kind of like, they're essentially the leadership of the MetaDAO. Like, I think these, like, they're what the clusters that currently exist will become, the administration teams for MetaDAOs. You know, they're kind of roughly analogous to like core unit facilitators, like as a group. Like they sort of, it's not a great analogy because there's a bunch of other differences, but they're essentially the leadership of the MetaDAO, insofar as it has leadership. MetaDAOs can also have, like, you know, 0 to N contribution teams. So they can, and these can be either teams that, like, you know, contribute to something directly in the MetaDAO. They can be like teams that the MetaDAO just like outsources as a source of revenue. So it's like a MetaDAO could just like a creator MetaDAO could just like have a team that like helps other projects with, I don't know, their financial reports, right? Like, and like they could kind of outsource that team to other DAOs, not even like other MetaDAOs or other DAOs in the crypto space, make money. So there's those. There's also this idea of like, what is it called again? Like like ecosystem actors, which are essentially just like contractors that do work for pay to do specific things, and they can be hired obviously by MetaDAOs or anyone really. So that's kind of the structure of like a MetaDAO roughly, is that you have like this administration team and then some contribution teams. In kind of Maker Core, you have what are called scopes, which we kind of have to talk about briefly before we get to councils and tribunals. Scopes are sort of essentially just areas of work. I mean, it's not that different from the regular definition of scope, really. But it's like it's just an area of work which MakerDAO has kind of agreed that is important and that will make decisions and take actions on, around and take actions on. And a scope, depending on whether it's a primary scope or a supporting scope, primary scope is anything that's sort of directly related to the sort of business of MakerDAO. Supporting is just sort of a scope that allows that to happen or allows the DAO to organize or manages MetaDAOs or something. So you have these scopes, and the scopes are sort of managed essentially, or like overseen by either, so the primary scopes are overseen by like a council, and the council is made up of, I believe, members of MetaDAO, like leaders of MetaDAO contribution teams and or members of the administration teams, depending on what the scope is. And also, it might have delegates in as well. I'm not 100% sure whether councils include delegates. So it's essentially a bunch of these members of administration and contribution teams from a bunch of different MetaDAOs that sort of come together and sort of determine how to implement the scope. I want to say implement the scope. Haven't kind of covered governance MetaDAOs up to this point either, because governance MetaDAOs are a little different in that they run core units, I want to say. And the core unit's job is to hire ecosystem actors, administration teams or contribution teams to actually implement the scopes. Governor DAOs can like maintain a core unit for like as many scopes as they want, as many as they can. And then, so you have the councils and tribunals that are sort of, that's right, so councils and tribunals set what's called the scope framework, which is kind of a description of what the scope includes. The core units operated by governor DAOs then look at those scopes and essentially work as like, what's the word? Like a, kind of like an outsourcer, right? Someone like a group that sort of goes and finds contractors to do a thing.
The ranger? I'm not in a ranking.
Yeah, yeah. I'll try not to overload terminology with this. But yeah, so they go out and find people to do this thing. They could be ecosystem actors, they could be members of MetaDAOs, etc. And then they work on scope. The scope frameworks are MIPS. I'm not sure if I mentioned that, which means they need to be approved. Oh, do they need to be approved by governance? Maybe they don't need to be approved by governance. I don't know. I think you can probably tell I don't have the most firm grasp on this because I think it's a little complicated and a little underspecified, despite being really long. But you maybe get the gist of it, hopefully.
Yeah, we did. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's very difficult. And actually, there is a DVC call that happened last night. It hasn't been posted to YouTube yet, but I'll try to link it to here, which it goes over the council tribunals and the frameworks and how it works and the actors. But one thing you posted on the EndGame commentary, and I wanted to touch upon because we didn't get into the three types of MetaDAOs, which is governance MetaDAOs, creator MetaDAOs, and the protector MetaDAOs. We still didn't even cover that, right? And we're running out of time here, but I believe the governance MetaDAOs, they don't benefit. I think you wrote this on the EndGame commentary. They don't benefit from any upside like the protector or creator MetaDAOs, better yet. They get about a 20 to 25% revenue share of the stability fees.
Yes, so that's not strictly true. They can benefit in the same ways. It's just not their core focus, right? So the kind of thing that was is I don't think they're ever going to be able to be the ones to do anything revenue generating first. Like creator DAOs, their job is to kind of go out and find find ways to make revenue through revenue shares. Protector DAOs kind of the same with real assets. Governor DAOs kind of core objective is different, and they do get revenue from it because it's their core. Governor DAO's core objective is to sort of operate the scopes that we kind of talked about, right? Not actually implement them, but manage the scopes and do the outsourcing, which Maker does pay them for, but it's not because they're getting paid to do a strict thing. There's no there's no kind of chance of exponential gains, I guess is the way that we think of it. They can't become super a revenue share thing, right? So if you have a revenue share something on something and it becomes super popular, you get $2 billion, $2 billion worth of collateral or something in your revenue share thing, then suddenly that 25% of fees you're getting is a huge amount, and it's loads. So the upside and because the creator DAOs and protector DAOs are directly focused on that, they're likely to benefit from it more than governor DAOs. So my kind of conclusion as part of the opinions was that in a situation where MetaDAOs compete, which is the plan, it seems likely that governor DAOs are going to be outcompeted by creator DAOs and protector DAOs, especially. And by outcompeted, I mean just the tokens will be worth more for if they're worth anything, but the tokens are more likely to be worth more, I think, for creators and protector MetaDAOs. And that's maybe fine. It depends how big the difference is. But if everyone thinks that the governor DAO tokens are not very good, then they're not going to have a community as big. They're going to have all these other issues. So that's kind of that was one of my concerns, yeah, for sure, about the interactions between the competitive state between governors and protectors and creators.
And to you wrote here that it would be beneficial to remove governor MetaDAOs and transfer their functionality to Maker Core. Is that pretty much what you were just saying?
So that's kind of a consequence of that opinion, right? That's going to be a problem. Is that instead of giving them their own token, instead of separating them and putting them in a MetaDAO and forcing them to compete, you keep them in Maker Core because they're more likely. Well, I think it's more likely to be stable there, I think. And some sort of other benefits that I think are there. We should maybe talk about just what the actual MetaDAOs are, though, because I don't think we've covered that yet, which is maybe potentially confusing everyone that's listening to this. So maybe we should talk about that. Creator DAOs, I guess. So their job is they can adopt vaults from Maker Core with both parties' consent, Maker Core and the MetaDAO. When vaults are adopted, the MetaDAO the creator DAO becomes responsible for them, essentially, responsible for any losses, but they also gain this revenue share on the stability fees. And And that kind of means CreatorDAO's kind of core objective is to sort of go out and try and, yeah, so sort of as well as adopting vaults, they can sort of go out and like source new vaults, like through new collateral types, etc., under kind of the same deal, right? Like they get a share of the revenue, but they're responsible for losses. And it's kind of in this way that like is the hope that Maker scales, because the CreatorDAOs are sort of very incentivized to benefit themselves by getting a lot of collateral under these revenue shares, and that also in turn benefits Maker. Protected DAOs do a similar thing, but strictly for real-world asset vaults. Again, they can kind of adopt existing ones with both Maker cores and their consent, and they can go out and source new ones, again with the same sort of revenue share agreements and like being responsible for losses. And then governor DAOs are kind of can adopt vaults and do revenue share things for decentralized vaults, not real-world asset vaults. But their main kind of goal is to, as I said, sort of manage the scope frameworks and kind of operate core units that can then outsource to workers to actually implement the scopes. Maybe that's a good brief description for those who also know what they are. Did I miss anything important? I guess that they all the MetaDAOs do some things together, like they all run front ends, which provide access to Maker core like functionality like vaults and like governance. They also include, I think, the MetaDAO governance stuff for the individual MetaDAO. They allow farming. They're kind of meant to be like a decentralized and kind of resilient sort of way to access Maker, and that's the benefit to Maker, I guess.
For sure. You also you talk about you kind of give a little spice to the end game here by suggesting that MetaDAO should be called meta units. What's the thinking here?
Yes, so that was kind of as a result of my observation that like a lot of the benefits that Rune sort of laid out for MetaDAOs, you would just get without the actual DAO part, right? Like, you know, you don't need to have a token, I don't think, to spin off like a unit that's sort of very generalized, that's sort of clustered together, that's kind of agrees. You know, they can decide to do something, they can have revenue shares, they can have all these things. They don't really need to be a DAO. Like there's nothing in those parts of the requirements, I guess, that requires a DAO. Like, you know, they can still run a front end, they can still be, you know, you can even still give them their own internal governance system if you want it to remain DAO to DAO. You can interact with them solely through their votes on the snapshot or on chain. Like but like it doesn't feel that like a token is necessary for like many of those benefits. Yeah, that's essentially the gist of it. Like you kind of don't get the meta value of community, but that's also something I'm kind of deeply skeptical about, like how feasible it's going to be to create. So that's kind of my reasoning for meta units.
But I mean, a token is necessary, right? So for the setup about the token emissions, some kind of governance token for those units is necessary, right? Is it?
So we're emitting Maker anyway, right? So you could emit Maker and give it to them, and to do for the revenue shares for the thing. Sorry, you can emit Maker as part of the farms for like ETH and DAI and Maker governance that go through their front ends, right? Like there's. I mean, I agree the tokenomics are the reason for having tokens, right? But I'm not sure how many reasons there are for having tokens outside of the tokenomics, is I guess what I'm saying. Especially when we already have a token Maker, which we are already planning to emit under the plan.
All right, I think Raphael, you want to take us to the home stretch here? You have a question for LongForWisdom?
We were running out of time, so just like as a wrap-up question, I'd like to conclude with something spicy. LongForWisdom, like, what's your biggest concern about? Like, where do you see like the major risk of the EndGame plan, and maybe you have some idea about like if or how this can be mitigated?
I mean, I think the major risk is just that it's based on assumptions that may not turn out to be true. Like that's probably like the meta kind of risk that I see that kind of underpins all of these risks. Is that the way Rune has written it, he's written it based on assumptions of how things work in practice. And you know what I'm saying, like, you know, he's obviously wrong about all of them. Like, I don't know how many of them have been like empirically shown to be true. And like, if we are doing a plan based on assumptions that we have not, like, do not know, like, have not seen examples of, at least of being true in how things work in the wild, then like there's no guarantee it's going to work. And like the risk, not the risk, but like and the reason that's such a big problem for this is because it changes and disrupts everything at once. Like, it changes like how the core works, it changes how it scales, it changes where things are, it changes the tokenomics, it changes like everything. Which means that if it doesn't work, then it's just like, it just kills Maker. Like, it's not going to be an either or thing. It's just like, if it doesn't work if it doesn't work enough or if those assumptions aren't true enough to make the thing work, then it just won't work, and like Maker will stop working, or we'll lose money and we'll collapse into a state which is, I guess, close to the the RAI plus thing that Rune was saying. So like that's my major concern, just that the assumptions that this plan has been made under like may not be true, and if they're not true, then and that's kind of exacerbated by the fact there's no way back. Like, there's no built-in, like the way Rune's pitching the plan is like, we agree to do the plan in some form, and if there are problems, we just like work around them, but we're still doing the plan. Like, there's no like fallback position. There's no way to reverse course if we do empirically test these things or see these things and see that they actually don't work. So yeah, I think that's maybe the sort of base level concern.
In the current state that MakerDAO is today, Schuppi, does MakerDAO become the next AOL of crypto?
Well, this is not why I came here, right? And I actually don't agree with this is not reversible, because it's always reversible. We are just spending a lot of opportunity costs, or we're generating opportunity costs by not doing the other thing that might be better. But the worst thing that can happen is that we just lose a lot of momentum and waste a lot of energy, and by that money. But there is always a way back, and even if it's RAI plus, but MKR holders can always decide to revert the plan that have been decided to go for, I'd say.
Yeah, don't want to use up too much time, but you're correct. My concern is that if there's not a predefined way back, then that will essentially, like that mechanism where Maker holders decide like, had enough of this, will just be like chaos, and everyone will like bail.
Yeah, but I mean, this is what happens in every startup that is pivoting, right? Where it's never predefined. It's always that you try out stuff and you iterate, and maybe you realize that another thing might be better, and then you go the other route. So I think what I find exciting about the EndGame, to be honest, is more that that it is a way to decentralize the organization itself, and not only about MKR tokens and VCs and whatever, but that we really find a way of letting the workforce contribute in a unique way that hasn't been explored before. That's what I find interesting. All the other stuff about tokenomics and emissions and whatever, that's a secondary thing, which might work or work not. I really can't say that. Yeah, I have a clear opinion on that. What I can see is that so far we are struggling, and that we need to think about changing gears. And I feel that the EndGame plan is actually a good step at it. And yeah, it's not like it's a forum post and next week it's going to be voted on. We are thinking about or talking about this for months now.
And it is changing. Like, I think it is vastly improving already in the last couple of months. So I'm actually quite excited, and I think the scaling approach is really unique, and it's very organic, and that's why I think it has an amazing chance to develop like a new paradigm for organizing, which I'd love to see.
Yeah. And for many people, that's the reason why they joined Maker, not because of the product, but because of the social experiment that we have in a DAO. And that was one of the drivers for me as well.
Which is why this show is so important. So thanks, Frank,
yeah,
and Schuppi, for making a show with drinks, which is like the best social experiment that you can have.
Hey, Long, where can people find you if they want to get in touch? I guess the Maker Forum would be one, but if you can give us kind of like your details.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not on Twitter, so I don't tend to have too much of a public presence outside of Maker. But yeah, Maker Forum's fine. I'm also on Discord, on the Maker Discord. So yeah, thanks guys.
Terrific. Well, it was great having you, LongForWisdom. I hope we get you back because we definitely didn't even cover maybe 20% of it, maybe not even 20%. So, but yeah, that was awesome, guys. I really appreciate it. We'll see you next time on the Schuppi and ElPro MakerDAO Happy Hour.
And thanks a lot, Long. That was great.